All right, are you ready to dive into the world of moral dilemmas? Today we're taking a deep dive into the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on, well, moral dilemmas. We're not just skimming the surface, we're going deep, deep, deep with the help of our expert here.
It's definitely a topic that deserves a thorough exploration, you know? I mean, the philosophical implications, they're huge and often lead to more questions than answers, honestly.
Okay, so before we get totally lost in the weeds, I think it's good to start with the basics. How does the Stanford Encyclopedia define a moral dilemma? Like, what makes a situation a true dilemma versus just a tough choice we face in our everyday lives?
It's a great question, and honestly, that distinction is super important. You see, the encyclopedia, it lays out some very, very specific criteria. A true moral dilemma isn't just about feeling conflicted or having to make a hard decision, you know? It's more than that. It involves an agent, which is just a fancy way of saying the person facing the choice who is required to perform two or more actions.
Okay, so there's more than one right thing to do, morally speaking.
Exactly. But here's the catch. The agent, they can actually do each of these actions. They're not impossible tasks.
So they're capable, they have the means, but then something stops them.
Precisely. They can't perform all of the actions that are required. Something's got to give.
Yeah.
And the truly defining feature of a dilemma, neither of these conflicting requirements overrides the other one. It's like they're on equal moral footing.
Ah, I see. So it's not like those conflicts where one obligation might outweigh the other one. Like keeping a promise is important, but helping someone in danger is more important. This is more like being pulled in multiple directions with like equal force, and there's no clear way to satisfy every single obligation.
You got it. And it's this inevitability of wrongdoing, knowing that no matter what you choose, something bad is going to happen. That's the thing that really sets a moral dilemma apart from just a regular, everyday conflict of duties.
Okay, yeah, I think I'm starting to feel the weight of this concept already, even though we haven't even gotten into specific examples yet. So, speaking of examples, I know the encyclopedia mentioned some classic dilemmas. Can you give us one? A real head scratcher.
Oh, absolutely. We can go all the way back to like ancient Greece, Plato's Republic. There's a great example there about a guy who has borrowed a weapon from a friend, right? Seems simple enough, right?
Yeah, I'd say so.
But then the friend, he comes back to get his weapon back. Totally reasonable. But here's the thing, he's clearly not in his right mind. He might be a danger to himself or others.
Whoa, okay, yeah, that changes things a bit. So now you're stuck between upholding your promise, returning the weapon like you agreed, or, potentially contributing to some kind of harm, or you break your promise, you refuse to give the weapon back, but maybe you prevent a tragedy. Tough choice.
Exactly. And what's really interesting here is that this dilemma, it shows how even basic moral principles like keeping your promises can clash with other important principles, like protecting others from harm.
Right, and I think that's a great illustration of how these moral dilemmas, they're not just abstract thought experiments, right? They get at the core of how we navigate our real-world relationships and the responsibilities we have to each other.
Yeah.
Do you have any other examples, maybe something more modern that really illustrates this point?
Well, Jean-Paul Sartre, the existentialist philosopher, he offers a pretty powerful dilemma that takes place during World War II. It's about this young man who is torn between two like really compelling obligations. He could join the resistance to avenge his brother who was killed and, fight against the Nazis, but he could also stay home and take care of his grieving mother who, relies on him completely.
Oh man, that's rough. It really highlights how these dilemmas, they're not just about abstract principles. They're about, the deep personal and emotional weight that these choices have on people. I mean, both options have such huge consequences, not just for him, but for those around him. And then you also have to consider the bigger consequences, like the impact on the resistance, the fight for justice. I mean, are there any examples from, say, literature or modern applied ethics that kind of grapple with this type of dilemma?
Oh, yeah, tons. I mean, Sophie's Choice, both the book and the film, is like a perfect example. It's a really intense exploration of this problem. It's about this Polish woman, Sophie. She's imprisoned in a Nazi concentration camp, and she's forced to make this just unimaginable choice.
Hmm.
Which one of her two children will be sent to their death? And if she refuses to choose, they'll both be killed.
Wow, that's just devastating. It's just, I don't even know what to say. And the emotional impact of these situations, that feeling of being totally trapped, knowing that whatever you choose, there will be consequences you can't escape. It just, I mean, I could definitely see why some philosophers would try to find a way to avoid these situations entirely. Who wants to live in a world where these kinds of choices are even possible?
You'd think that with all their ethical theories, all the logical frameworks they've developed, they would have come up with some foolproof way to, I don't know, navigate these dilemmas or even just completely sidestep them altogether.
Right, like a dilemma-proof system where we always know the right thing to do, the path that avoids harm and always leads to the absolute best outcome. Like, did any philosophers ever actually try to create something like that?
Yeah.
How did they think they could eliminate these moral quandaries?
Many did. Like you had thinkers like Kant, Mill, and Ross. They were all convinced that their ethical theories, at least in principle, should get rid of the possibility of running into genuine moral dilemmas. They thought, hey, if you have a well thought out moral system, it should offer really clear guidance and help us avoid these super tricky conflicts.
So how did they go about that? What was their strategy for making this dilemma-proof system?
One common approach was to try to create a kind of hierarchy of moral precepts. It's like you rank the moral rules or principles in order of importance, right? And then if you ever have a conflict, the higher up principle always wins. It's like a moral pecking order, I guess you could say.
Okay, so if you had something like don't harm others is ranked higher than, say, keep your promises, then you'd know which one to follow if they ever clashed. Seems pretty straightforward at first. So where does the problem come in with this?
It turns out that actually ranking moral rules consistently, like across the board, is really, really difficult. The context, it matters so much. What might just be a small promise in one situation, it could be like a huge, deeply important commitment in another one.
Yeah, I get that. Like a tiny promise versus, I don't know, saving someone's life. The
Mm.
hierarchy in that case, it seems super obvious. But what about, I don't know, like a big promise that would only cause a little bit of harm to someone else? Or
Yeah.
what about a promise that prevents you from helping a whole bunch of people?
Exactly. And those are just like the most basic examples. Then you have things like symmetrical dilemmas. We talked about Sophie's Choice before. That's a perfect example. That throws a huge wrench in this whole hierarchy idea. Because remember, it's the same principle. The love she has for both her children, that's what's actually causing the conflict. So a hierarchy system, it doesn't help us figure out which child she should choose to save.
So even with all their smarts, these big-name philosophers, they couldn't quite crack the dilemma code. Where does that leave us, logically speaking? If these situations are possible, does that mean our ethical systems are just, I don't know, like broken, full of inconsistencies?
Now we're getting into the real meat of this philosophical debate. The very idea that moral dilemmas could exist has led some philosophers to question the logic behind, well, all of our ethical thinking.
Okay, I'm ready for a logic puzzle. Hit me with it. How exactly do these inconsistencies show up?
Well, there are two main arguments that kind of expose these potential logical weaknesses. The first one digs into what's called deontic logic. It's the branch of logic that focuses on things like obligation and permission. There's this principle in deontic logic called deontic consistency. It basically says that the same action cannot be both obligatory, meaning you have to do it, and forbidden, meaning you absolutely cannot do it. It makes sense, right?
Yeah, I mean, that seems pretty obvious. You can't be required to do something and not do it at the same time. Basic logic.
Right. Now, the fact that dilemmas exist, the way we've been talking about them, it doesn't automatically go against this principle, right? But when you add in another principle from deontic logic, things get a bit messy. This other principle, it says that if you do some action A, and that always leads to outcome B, and doing action A is obligatory, then outcome B is also obligatory.
Okay, I think I'm following so far. But how does that principle create a problem when we're thinking about dilemmas?
So let's break it down. In a dilemma, you have an obligation to do action A and an obligation to do action B, but you can't do both. If you do one, you can't do the other. So not doing A becomes like a requirement for doing B. They just can't exist together. Okay, so now, if you use that second principle we talked about, if doing B is obligatory and not doing A is necessary for doing B, then not doing A also becomes obligatory. But remember, at the very beginning, we said that A was obligatory in the first place.
Oh, wow. So now we have the situation where A is both obligatory and forbidden at the same time. That goes totally against the whole idea of deontic consistency.
Exactly. It creates this paradox in the system. And to make it even trickier, that idea of deontic consistency, it's kind of backed up by two other big principles that most ethical systems rely on. The first one is, if an action is obligatory, it's got to be permissible too. And the second one is, an action is only permissible if it's not forbidden. They're all connected, so if one of them falls apart, well, the others become kind of shaky too.
Okay, so this first argument is essentially saying, look, if these dilemmas are actually real, then maybe some of the basic ideas we have about how obligations work, how ought works, they might be wrong. What about the second argument? Does it go after those same ideas?
The second argument, it also uses that same basic idea of a moral dilemma as its starting point, but it brings in two more commonly accepted ethical principles. One is it's the ought implies can't principle. Pretty intuitive, right? It just means if you have an obligation to do something, you actually have to be capable of doing it.
Yeah, that makes sense. It wouldn't be fair to hold someone accountable for something they literally couldn't do. What's that second principle?
It's called the agglomeration principle. It says that if an agent has to do two different actions, then they're also required to do both those actions together.
Okay, I see. But I'm not quite seeing how that leads to a contradiction when we're talking about dilemmas. Can you walk me through it?
Sure. So in a dilemma, remember, you should do A and you should do B, but doing both is impossible. They can't both happen. Now, if we're saying ought implies can is true, then being obligated to do A and B means you must be able to do both. But the very definition of a dilemma tells us you can't.
Oh, got it. So the second argument is like, it's like they're teaming up to take down the whole logic of dilemmas. The agglomeration principle says, hey, you got to do both. And then ought implies can jumps in and says, well, then you must be able to do both. And boom, contradiction. So what happens next in this whole philosophical debate? Do the philosophers just throw in the towel and say, like, hope, ethics is just a mess, there's no logic to it at all?
Not quite. Philosophers, they love a good debate. And that whole question about whether or not genuine moral dilemmas are even possible has been a back and forth discussion for ages. It's fascinating, honestly. You basically have two groups here. You have those who say true dilemmas just can't exist, and then you have those who say, nope, they're real, and we got to figure out what that means for us.
Okay, so it's like a philosophical fight club, I guess. I'm intrigued. What are the main arguments from each side? What are their reasons for believing or not believing in the possibility of true moral dilemmas?
Well, the philosophers who say that genuine moral dilemmas can't exist, they often point to those principles we were just talking about as being like the foundation of ethical thinking. Deontic consistency, ought implies can, agglomeration. They argue that these principles are just so important, so baked into how we understand morality that we can't just throw them out.
So they're basically saying, if these principles clash with the whole idea of true dilemmas, then it's the dilemmas that have to go, not the principles. It's like those principles are the bedrock of morality, and anything that goes against them is on shaky ground.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Some philosophers in this camp, they suggest that maybe we're just not understanding these situations correctly. Maybe we're missing something. Like some hidden factor or some even bigger principle that we're not seeing, or even a totally different way to think about the problem that could reveal a solution.
Like a moral optical illusion. What seems like an impossible dilemma from one angle might actually have a clear answer if you shift your perspective or, consider some other factors or just re-examine what you're assuming to be true.
That's a really good analogy. And some philosophers, they even propose that in symmetrical dilemmas like Sophie's Choice, the obligation isn't like an and obligation, it's an or obligation.
And versus or. Okay, remind me what those terms mean. I'm a little rusty on my logic vocabulary.
No problem. A conjunctive obligation, that's an and obligation. It's where you're required to do like A and B. A disjunctive obligation is an or obligation. You have to do A or B. So like with Sophie, it's not save child A, and D, save child B, which is impossible, but save child A or save child B. You're not obligated to do both, but you have to do at least one.
Right, yeah, that makes sense, logically.
Yeah.
But does it really get rid of the dilemma, especially emotionally? I mean, Sophie still has to make a horrible choice. She still has to live with the loss of one of her children, even while saving the other one.
That's one of the big disagreements in this debate. Philosophers who are against dilemmas, they might say, hey, the logic is solid, there's a way out, even if it's really painful. But those who say that dilemmas are real, they argue that this kind of ignores the actual experience of being in that situation. The awful weight of making those impossible choices. It's not just about abstract logic, it's about real people struggling with these awful decisions and the horrible things that happen because of them.
Okay, so what are the arguments on that side of things? The side that says dilemmas are real. Why do some philosophers insist that these dilemmas are real and can't just be explained away with logic?
Well, one thing they often point out is that even if we could find some kind of logical loophole for every single dilemma, it wouldn't erase how painful and awful those situations actually are. Those heartbreaking examples we talked about before, Sophie's Choice, Sartre's Student, the countless real-world situations, they're powerful evidence that dilemmas are a real part of how we experience morality.
It's like they're saying, don't just tell me it works out on paper. Look at how much these situations hurt people. Look at the loss and the sacrifice. That has to mean something. We can't just ignore how people actually feel.
Exactly. They say that a neat logical solution often doesn't reflect how messy and complicated real moral conflicts are. And they're even willing to challenge those big principles that the other side holds on to so tightly. They might argue that the ought implies can principle. It just doesn't work when you're dealing with a true dilemma. If you really should do two things, but you just can't do both, then, well, ought doesn't always imply can. The principle breaks down.
And what about that other principle we discussed, the one from deontic logic, the one that says if A always leads to B and you have to do A, then you also have to do B? Do they have a counter argument for that one too?
Yeah, a lot of the philosophers who are in favor of dilemmas, they just straight up reject that principle. They say it's too simple, that it doesn't capture how nuanced and sometimes paradoxical moral reasoning can be. In the real world, making moral choices often means having conflicting obligations, making tough compromises, and accepting that sometimes there's just no perfect answer. There's no way to satisfy every moral demand.
It seems like we've reached a point where there's no clear winner. Both sides make some pretty good points, and I can see how this debate could go on forever. So what do you think? Where do you stand on this whole dilemma of dilemmas? Do you think we can resolve them, or are they just unavoidable conflicts in our moral systems?
It's a tough one. I think both sides bring up some really important points. The arguments against dilemmas, they force us to really look closely at the logical foundation of our ethical systems. Can we build a system that's perfectly consistent, works in every situation, and gets rid of all possible conflicts? It's a huge challenge, and trying to do that has shown us just how complicated and maybe even limited our moral thinking can be. But the arguments for dilemmas, I find those pretty convincing too. They remind us that ethics isn't just about abstract logic. It's about how we deal with the messiness of human experience, where choices have consequences, and even the best decision can leave you feeling like you lost something or had to compromise something important.
I think you're right. It seems like the core of this debate is about the tension between wanting clear moral guidance, a system that tells us exactly what to do, and realizing that the world and our place in it is way more complex than any system could ever fully account for.
Yeah, that's a great observation. We want those simple answers, those universal rules that can help us deal with life's challenges. But as we've seen, life just doesn't work that way. Moral dilemmas, they force us to face the limits of our ethical systems and realize that sometimes the best we can do is choose the least bad option, knowing that there will be consequences and that we might have to let go of some values and that we might still feel regret or, some moral residue long after we've made the decision.
That takes us back to this idea of moral residue, which we touched on a bit earlier. Can you unpack that a little more? What does it actually mean to experience this moral residue, and how does it affect how we think about and handle these dilemmas?
Moral residue, it's that feeling of guilt or remorse or regret or even just a sense that you've gone against your own values. And it sticks around even after you've made what you believe to be the best choice in a tough situation. It's that lingering feeling that no matter what you chose, something was lost, like you had to pay a moral price.
So even if you manage to choose the lesser of two evils, the option that does the least harm, you might still feel awful about it. The dilemma doesn't just disappear.
Right. And I think this is one of the most powerful reasons to believe that genuine moral dilemmas actually exist. If there was always a logically correct answer, a way to make everyone happy and satisfy all the moral requirements, then we wouldn't expect to have this moral residue hanging over us. The fact that we do feel these things, the guilt, the regret, the sense of compromise, it suggests that sometimes there's just no winning move. There's only a choice between different kinds of loss.
It's almost like those feelings of moral residue. They're proof that some dilemmas just can't be resolved. It's the emotional echo of those obligations and values that we couldn't fully honor.
I like that. It's a good way to think about it. And it also reminds us that dealing with a moral dilemma doesn't end when you make the decision. There's often a lot of emotional and psychological stuff to work through afterward, a process of coming to terms with the choice you made and the values you might have had to compromise on.
Well, this has been a really fascinating look at moral dilemmas, but I feel like we've only just scratched the surface. There's so much more to explore here, like all the different types of dilemmas, the role of emotions, what it means for responsibility, and so much more. We'd probably do a whole series on just this.
Totally. And I really hope our listeners keep thinking about these questions, digging deeper into the philosophy, and doing their own thought experiments. Moral dilemmas, they're not just abstract puzzles. They're woven into our lives, they shape the choices we make, our relationships, and how we understand ourselves and the world.
Well, thank you so much for guiding us through this really complex and interesting topic. I have a feeling our listeners will be thinking about these questions for a long time.
It was my pleasure. Keep those philosophical wheels turning, everyone.